Hi, my name is Amanda Rocha. I am an estate planning and probate attorney in California, and today I want to talk to you about community property. But before I get into that, I want to give you my contact information. You can find me on my website at www.amandarocalaw.com, or you can comment down below if this platform allows you to do that. On social media, I am at Amanda Rocha Law. So today I thought I would explain a little bit about community property to you because I was having a conversation with a few hundred of my closest friends in a group that I belong to the other day about the confusion of community property. Someone had mentioned something about whether or not an asset would be theirs in a divorce. And while I am not a divorce attorney, I can explain to people what is separate property and what is community property. So the first thing you should know is that not every state has the same rule about community property. There are 7 community property states that I can recall. California is definitely a community property state. So if you live in California, this is for you. And if you don't live in California, be careful watching my videos because I am barred in California, and that's basically what I'm talking about all the time, California specific laws. So California community property. Most people know that community property is the property owned between a married couple, right? Well, how does it become community property? What is community property literally, right? So it's not just land. It's not just your home or real property as it's known. It's all items, including personal property. So it could be a piece of furniture. It could be real property. It could be money in a bank account. Okay. So any of that could be labeled community or separate property. So before I really dive into what community property is, I need to explain what separate property is. So as a single person, anything that is gifted to you or anything you've earned is your property, your single separate property. And if you go into a marriage both having separate property, you get married, right? But your separate property remains separate unless you commingle those things. So for example, if you each have $2,000 in your checking accounts and you combined to a joint checking account, and you have agreed that you're both going to use that money for whatever, then you've commingled your funds, and that will be community property if you spend it together. There are a lot of specialty nuances in this area of the law, okay? So it is possible that you've commingled funds and they can be traced back and taken back as separate property later on in the event of a divorce. But if you have a small amount that you've commingled and you've spent more than that amount, or even a large amount and you've spent more than that amount and you haven't kept it separately in some sort of ledger, most likely it's going to remain community property. Another example of community property would be any income you've earned the second you get married and forward, as long as you are together and married and not legally separated. At that point, community property is no longer, your earned income is no longer community property. So from the second you become married until the second you are separate and apart, which is a legal term of art, consult a divorce lawyer if you're in the situation. That would be anything earned is community property, including retirement that you've earned, goodwill between you and your business and your customers, that is community property, and anything that you are gifted as a couple. Now, you can still earn separate property as a married person. That would be either you have a separate business entity or something. Let's say you bought a condo complex before you were married, and you used your separate property to buy that, and it takes care of itself. You don't put any of your commingled funds into that. Most of that is going to remain separate property. Any income that you've generated off of it will remain separate property. However, if you exert any labor and time and goodwill into it, that could kind of come back at you as community property. So it's very confusing. But in general, For your purposes and the purposes of this video, community property is anything earned during your marriage, and separate property is anything earned before or after. Another important thing with estate planning: if you receive an inheritance while you're married and it is only to one of the spouses, that is separate property. If you keep it in a separate account that your spouse does not have access to, then that will remain separate property. So if you and your spouses both spouses had an inheritance, let's say, from their parents. So they've been married 20 years. One of them gets an inheritance from their parents and the other gets the inheritance. They keep them separately. And then everything else has been commingled. They get divorced. In the divorce, the separate property would remain with the separate spouse and the community property would be split. This is not just important for divorces, but it is most commonly used in a divorce. But with estate planning, something that I do and discuss with all of my clients when we are going through all of their assets, everything that they own, all of their property, is we make sure we know what is separate and what is community, because it will pass differently upon your death. So for example, if you are married and you have separate property and community property, and you have children only with your spouse, okay? When you pass away, your separate property is going to go to, if you have an estate plan, it's going to go to your spouse, right? Unless you said otherwise. If you have children outside of marriage, it's not just going to go to them. Your separate property will be split between your children and your spouse, unless you've said otherwise in an estate plan. So if you pass away without an estate plan and you have separate property, it's not all going to go to your spouse. That will be split between your children and your spouse. Or, if you're not married, that's a whole different situation. You wouldn't have community property then anyway. So if you have any questions about what is separate property and what is community property, don't guess. It is very easy to assume that something is one thing when it is the other, and separate property can turn into community property, and you can physically choose to do that on your own by filling out a contract. So you can turn all your separate property into community property, or you can take community property and separate it between the two of you with a contract as well. So questions, let me know. Comment down below if you can. Go to my website, www.amandarocalaw.com, or find me on social media at Amanda Rocha Law. Thank you.